The desert wind carried whispers of scandal through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, a town that had seen more than its fair share of sinners and saints. But none had stirred the hearts and tongues of its residents quite like Evangeline Rose, the preacher's daughter who had fallen from grace in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Her raven-black hair caught the dying light of another scorching Arizona sunset as she stood on the porch of the saloon, her emerald eyes defiant, despite the shame that clung to her like the red dust that coated everything in this God-forsaken place. The townspeople had branded her with words sharper than any branding iron, calling her names that would make a hardened cowboy blush. But Evangeline held her head high, her spirit unbroken, even as her reputation lay in tatters at her feet. It was in this moment of her deepest despair that fate chose to intervene in the form of Colt Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. He rode into town on a stallion as black as his soul was rumored to be, his silver spurs catching the last rays of sunlight as he dismounted with the fluid grace of a predator. The leather of his gun belt creaked softly as he adjusted his twin Colts, weapons that had sent more men to their maker than the cholera epidemic of '73. His steel-gray eyes swept the street with the calculating gaze of a man who had learned long ago that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and mercy was a weakness that could get you killed faster than a rattlesnake's bite. Hey there, friend! Before we dive deeper into this tale of passion and redemption, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to me, and I love connecting with viewers from all corners of the globe. The first time their eyes met across the dusty main street, it was like watching lightning strike twice in the same spot. Evangeline felt something stir deep within her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced since before her world came crashing down around her ears, like a house of cards in a tornado. Colt, for his part, found himself momentarily stunned by the raw beauty and unmistakable pain he saw reflected in those emerald depths, recognizing in her the same wounded spirit that had driven him to become the man he was today. The townspeople scattered like tumbleweeds before a storm as he approached her, their whispered warnings falling on deaf ears as he tipped his black hat in her direction with a gesture that was equal parts respectful and dangerous. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a Bowie knife as Colt stepped onto the saloon porch, his boots echoing against the weathered wood like the countdown to high noon. Evangeline's breath caught in her throat as she took in the full measure of the man before her, from his broad shoulders that strained against his black shirt, to the way his dark hair curled slightly at the collar, giving him an almost boyish charm that contrasted sharply with the deadly reputation that followed him like a shadow. When he spoke, his voice was like aged whiskey, smooth and warm, with just enough bite to remind you it could burn if you weren't careful. "Ma'am," he said simply, his eyes never leaving hers as he removed his hat, revealing hair that was the color of midnight and eyes that held secrets darker than the bottom of a mine shaft. "I couldn't help but notice you look like you could use a friend in this town." His words were carefully chosen, each one weighted with meaning that went far deeper than their surface suggested, and Evangeline found herself drawn to him like a moth to flame, despite every instinct screaming at her to run as far and as fast as her legs could carry her. The wind picked up, sending her skirts swirling around her ankles, and carrying with it the scent of sage and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. "And what makes you think I need a friend, stranger?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos raging in her heart, the words carrying just enough challenge to let him know she wasn't some helpless damsel in distress, despite what the good people of Redemption Creek might think. Colt's lips curved into a smile that was equal parts charming and dangerous, the kind of smile that had gotten him out of more tight spots than his guns ever had, though those had certainly played their part as well. "Call it intuition," he replied, his gaze taking in the proud set of her shoulders and the way she held herself like a queen, even in exile. "Plus, I've got a weakness for beautiful women who've been dealt a bad hand by life." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard, stripping away her defenses as effectively as if he had physically disarmed her, leaving her feeling vulnerable and exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the scandalous dress she wore. As the sun finally surrendered to the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that seemed to set the very air on fire, Evangeline found herself accepting his invitation to join him for a drink. Despite the voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like her father, warning her about the dangers of consorting with men of questionable character. But then again, her character was hardly above reproach these days, and there was something about Colt Blackwood that made her feel alive for the first time in months. Something that whispered of possibilities she had thought were lost to her forever. The saloon doors swung shut behind them with a finality that seemed to seal their fate, the sound echoing through the smoky interior like the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Inside, the piano player continued his melancholy tune, the notes hanging in the air like ghosts of better times, while the other patrons cast furtive glances in their direction, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of speculation that followed them to a corner table where shadows offered a semblance of privacy. Colt ordered whiskey for himself and whatever the lady preferred, his manner with the bartender polite but firm, the kind of courtesy that came naturally to a man who had been raised right before life had taught him harder lessons. Evangeline chose wine, something that reminded her of better days when she had been the toast of church socials and the pride of her father's congregation, before one moment of weakness had cost her everything she had ever held dear. "So," Colt said as their drinks arrived, his fingers wrapping around the glass with the same easy confidence he showed with his guns, "what's a preacher's daughter doing in a place like this?" The question was asked without judgment, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than condemnation. And Evangeline found herself wanting to tell him everything, to unburden herself to this stranger who looked at her without the disgust and disappointment she had grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of those who had once called her friend. The story spilled out of her like water from a broken dam, each word carrying with it the weight of months of shame and isolation. She told him about Thomas Whitmore, the banker's son who had courted her with pretty words and prettier promises, who had convinced her that their love was pure and holy enough to justify the liberties they had taken in the moonlight behind her father's church. She spoke of the morning she had discovered she was carrying his child, and the afternoon he had married the mayor's daughter instead, leaving her to face the consequences of their passion, alone and abandoned. Colt listened without interruption, his gray eyes never leaving her face, as she recounted the way her father had cast her out, in front of the entire congregation, his voice thundering with righteous indignation as he declared her dead to him and to God. She described the months that followed, the miscarriage that had taken her child, but not her shame, the way the townspeople had turned their backs on her one by one until she had nowhere left to go but the saloon, where at least the sinners were honest about what they were. When she finished, the silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross, the weight of her confession hanging in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Colt reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the touch sending electricity shooting up her arm and straight to her heart, where it lodged like a bullet she didn't want removed. "They called you a sinner," he said softly, his voice carrying a tenderness she hadn't expected from a man with his reputation. "But I see a woman who loved too much and trusted too easily. There's no sin in that, only heartbreak." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand, the simple gesture more intimate than any kiss she had ever received, and Evangeline felt tears she had thought long dried up begin to well in her eyes. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, afraid to break the spell that seemed to have settled over them like morning mist. "What brings the infamous Colt Blackwood to a nothing town like Redemption Creek?" She had heard the stories. Of course, whispered tales of a man who could outdraw lightning and had left a trail of bodies from Texas to California. But looking into his eyes now, she saw something that the stories had never mentioned: pain that ran as deep as her own. Colt's smile turned rueful, and he lifted his glass in a mock toast before draining it in one smooth motion. "Running from ghosts," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than a freight train. "Seems like we're both refugees from our past, darlin'. Maybe that makes us perfect for each other, or maybe it makes us the worst possible combination. Either way, I find myself not much caring about the consequences anymore." The night deepened around them like a velvet curtain, and with it came a sense of intimacy that had nothing to do with the physical space they occupied, and everything to do with the connection that was forming between two wounded souls who had found each other in the darkness. They talked until the saloon began to empty, sharing stories and secrets like children trading marbles, each revelation bringing them closer together, despite the rational part of both their minds that warned them they were playing with fire. When Colt finally walked her to the boarding house, where she had taken a room, the moon was high overhead, casting silver shadows on the dusty street and making everything look magical and otherworldly. They stood on the porch for a long moment, neither wanting to break the spell that had woven itself around them throughout the evening, both knowing that come morning, the harsh light of day might reveal their connection to be nothing more than an illusion born of loneliness and whiskey. "Evangeline," Colt said her name like a prayer, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that belied his reputation as a killer. "I want you to know that whatever happens, tonight you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." She leaned into his touch, like a flower turning toward the sun, her eyes fluttering close as she savored the warmth of human contact that didn't come with judgment or expectation. "What's that?" she whispered, her breath catching as his thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with reverent care. The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and she found herself holding her breath as she waited for his answer. "Hope," he said simply, the single word carrying more power than all the sermons her father had ever preached. "You gave me hope That maybe redemption isn't just a word painted on a town sign. Maybe it's something a man can actually find if he's lucky enough to meet the right woman. His words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and making her heart race like a wild Mustang. Before she could respond, before she could think of all the reasons why this was dangerous and foolish and bound to end in heartbreak, Colt leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. It lasted only a moment, but in that brief contact, Evangeline felt something inside her that had been broken begin to heal, like the first green shoots of grass after a long, hard winter. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air between them crackled with electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Good night, Evangeline Rose," Colt said, his voice rough with emotion as he stepped back, his hands falling to his sides with obvious reluctance. "Sweet dreams, darlin'." She watched him walk away, his figure gradually swallowed by the shadows, until only the sound of his spurs remained, a lonely melody that seemed to echo the beating of her own heart. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Evangeline couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a turn that would change everything, for better or worse, and that come morning, she would have to decide whether she was brave enough to follow where this dangerous path might lead. The next few days passed in a blur of stolen glances and carefully orchestrated encounters that seemed casual, but were anything but. Colt made it his business to be wherever Evangeline happened to be, whether she was shopping for supplies at the general store or taking her evening walk around the town square. Each meeting was brief and proper on the surface, but underneath ran an undercurrent of attraction and understanding that grew stronger with each passing hour. The townspeople began to take notice, of course, their whispered conversations following Evangeline like a pack of hungry wolves. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, made it her personal mission to warn anyone who would listen about the dangers of allowing such a notorious gunfighter to court their fallen preacher's daughter, as if Evangeline's reputation could sink any lower than it already had. But for the first time since her fall from grace, Evangeline found that she didn't care what they thought, that the opinion of hypocrites and gossips mattered less than the way Colt's eyes lit up when he saw her coming down the street. It was on a Thursday evening, as the sun was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of the wildflowers that used to grow behind her father's church, that Colt finally made his intentions clear. He appeared at her boarding house with a bouquet of desert roses that he must have ridden miles to find, their delicate petals a stark contrast to his calloused hands as he offered them to her with a smile that made her knees weak. "Miss Evangeline," he said, his voice formal, but his eyes dancing with mischief, "I was wondering if you might do me the honor of joining me for dinner tomorrow evening. There's a place I know, about an hour's ride from town, where the stars shine brighter than diamonds, and a man can speak his mind without the whole world listening in." The invitation was innocent enough on the surface, but they both knew what he was really asking, and the weight of that unspoken question hung between them like morning mist. Evangeline's heart hammered against her ribs as she considered his proposal, knowing that accepting would be crossing a line from which there might be no return. She thought of her father's warnings about men like Colt, about the dangers of giving your heart to someone whose hands were stained with blood and whose future was written in gunpowder and lead. But then she looked into those steel-gray eyes and saw not a killer, but a man who was offering her something she had thought lost forever. The chance to be cherished and protected and loved for who she was, not who she had been. "I would be honored," she said softly, her voice steady, despite the butterflies performing aerial acrobatics in her stomach. "But I should warn you, Mr. Blackwood, that my reputation is already in tatters. Being seen in your company won't do either of us any favors with the good people of this town." Her words were meant as a warning, but there was a challenge in them too, a test to see if he was serious about his intentions or simply looking for an easy conquest. Colt's smile widened, and he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage scent that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. "Darlin'," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that sent shivers down her spine, "I stopped caring about what people thought of me the day I strapped on these guns. And as for your reputation, well, I figure a woman brave enough to hold her head high in the face of their judgment is exactly the kind of woman I want by my side." His words hit her like a physical caress, warming places in her heart that had been cold for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to feel truly alive. "Then I'll be ready at sunset," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "And Mr. Blackwood, thank you for the roses. They're beautiful." She buried her face in the fragrant blooms, using the gesture to hide the tears of gratitude that threatened to spill over, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of a man who saw beauty where others saw only shame. That night, Evangeline lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room, her mind racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. She thought about the way Colt looked at her, as if she were something precious and rare rather than damaged goods, and wondered if it was possible that she might actually deserve the happiness he seemed to be offering. The roses sat in a water glass on her nightstand, their sweet scent filling the room and reminding her that sometimes, even in the harshest desert, beautiful things could bloom. The following evening arrived with all the anticipation of Christmas morning, and the terror of Judgment Day rolled into one overwhelming package. Evangeline had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing, choosing her best dress, a deep blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes and made her feel almost like the lady she had once been. She had pinned her hair up in an elaborate style that had taken 3 attempts to get right, and applied just a touch of rouge to her lips and cheeks, wanting to look her best for this man who had somehow managed to see past her shame to the woman underneath. Colt arrived precisely at sunset, riding a magnificent chestnut mare that he had somehow acquired for the occasion, leading his own black stallion behind him. He was dressed in his finest clothes, a black suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and narrow waist, with a white shirt that made his tan skin look even darker by contrast. His hair was slicked back with pomade, and he had even trimmed his mustache. The effort he had put into his appearance, making Evangeline's heart flutter with the knowledge that this evening meant as much to him as it did to her. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he helped her mount the mare, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary, the contact sending heat racing through her veins like wildfire. "Like an angel who decided to grace us earthbound sinners with her presence." His words were poetry, and the way he said them, with such obvious sincerity, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worthy of such praise. They rode out of town as the sun was setting, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson that took Evangeline's breath away. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the promise of conversation to come and the simple pleasure of being in each other's company. The horses' hooves beat a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth, and the evening air carried the scent of sage and creosote, creating an atmosphere that was both romantic and wild, civilized and untamed. The place Colt had chosen for their dinner was a small oasis hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees, where a natural spring created a pool of crystal-clear water that reflected the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He had obviously been here before, had prepared for this evening with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to everything else in his life. A blanket was spread on the soft grass, and a basket of food waited nearby, along with a bottle of wine that must have cost him a week's wages. "How did you find this place?" Evangeline asked, as he helped her down from the mare, her hands resting on his shoulders as he lifted her effortlessly to the ground, the strength in his arms making her feel delicate and feminine in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. The oasis was like something out of a fairy tale, a hidden paradise in the middle of the harsh desert landscape, and she couldn't help but wonder how many other secrets this mysterious man was hiding. "I was running from a posse about 6 months ago," Colt said with a self-deprecating smile as he began unpacking the basket, his movements efficient and practiced. "My horse threw a shoe, and I thought I was done for. Then I saw the trees and figured if I was going to make my last stand, it might as well be somewhere beautiful. Turned out the posse gave up the chase about 10 miles back. But I stayed here for 3 days anyway, just thinking and trying to figure out what the hell I was doing with my life." His honesty was refreshing, and Evangeline found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in months. The combination of his easy manner and the magical setting working to dissolve the walls she had built around her heart. "And did you figure it out?" she asked, settling onto the blanket with a grace that would have made her finishing school teachers proud, her skirts arranged carefully around her, like the petals of a flower. Colt paused in his unpacking, his gray eyes meeting hers across the small space that separated them. And in that moment, the air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility. "I thought I had," he said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that made her pulse quicken. "But then I met you, and suddenly, all my carefully laid plans don't seem to matter anymore. Suddenly, I'm thinking about things I never thought I'd want again, like a home and a future and maybe even a family." The words hung between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Evangeline felt her breath catch in her throat as she realized what he was really saying. "Colt," she whispered, his name falling from her lips like a prayer. "You don't know what you're saying. I'm not the kind of woman who can give you those things. I'm damaged goods, remember? Fallen, ruined." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but they needed to be said, needed to be acknowledged before this went any further. He moved then, crossing the space between them in one fluid motion and taking her hands in his calloused fingers intertwining with her softer ones in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. "Listen to me, Evangeline Rose," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "You are not damaged. You are not ruined. You are a woman who loved and lost and had the courage to keep going when the whole world turned against you. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you the strongest person I've ever met." His words hit her like a physical blow, knocking down the walls she had built around her heart with the force of their sincerity. Tears she had been holding back for months finally spilled over, running down her cheeks like silver streams in the moonlight, and Colt reached up to brush them away with his thumbs, his touch so gentle it made her heart ache with longing. "They called me a sinner," she whispered, the words that had haunted her for so long, finally finding voice in the safety of his arms. "They said I was beyond redemption, that God himself had turned his back on me." The pain in her voice was raw and real, and Colt felt something inside his chest tighten with the need to protect her from any further hurt. "Then I'll be the devil who holds you tonight," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion as he pulled her closer, until she was sitting in the circle of his arms with her head resting against his chest, where she could hear the steady beating of his heart. "And every night after, if you'll have me. Because, darling, if loving you makes me a sinner, then I'll gladly burn in hell for the privilege." The kiss that followed was nothing like the gentle, tentative caress they had shared on her porch. This was fire and passion and desperate need, months of loneliness and longing poured into a single moment of connection that left them both breathless and wanting more. Evangeline's hands fisted in the fabric of his shirt as she kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion she had been carrying, tasting the promise of redemption on his lips and finding it sweeter than honey. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air around them seemed to crackle with electricity. The stars had come out in full force while they were lost in each other, turning the sky into a canopy of diamonds that seemed to bless their union with celestial approval. The sound of the spring bubbling nearby provided a gentle soundtrack to their whispered confessions and promises, creating an atmosphere that was both intimate and eternal. "I love you," Colt said simply, the words falling from his lips with the weight of absolute truth. "I know it's crazy. I know we've only known each other a few days, but I love you, Evangeline Rose, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." His declaration was bold and honest and completely without reservation, and it hit her like a lightning bolt to the heart. "I love you too," she whispered back, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff into the unknown, terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "God help me, I love you too, Colt Blackwood, even though I know it's probably going to destroy us both." Her words were a mixture of joy and fear, hope and desperation, and they both knew that what they were feeling was dangerous and wonderful and completely beyond their control. They made love under the stars that night, their bodies coming together with a passion that was both tender and fierce, desperate and reverent. Colt worshipped her with his hands and mouth and whispered words of love, erasing the shame and pain of her past with every caress, every kiss, every murmured endearment. Evangeline gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back, trusting him with her body and her heart and her future in ways she had never trusted anyone before. Afterward, they lay entwined on the blanket, her head pillowed on his chest, as they watched the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. The night air was cool against their heated skin, but wrapped in each other's arms, they felt warm and safe and complete in ways that neither had ever experienced before. They talked in whispers about their dreams and fears, their hopes for the future, and their regrets about the past, sharing the kind of intimate conversation that only comes in the aftermath of profound physical and emotional connection. "What happens now?" Evangeline asked, as dawn began to paint the eastern horizon in shades of pink and gold, reality creeping back in with the approaching daylight. Where do we go from here? The questions that had been lurking in the back of her mind all night finally demanded to be voiced, and she felt Colt's arms tighten around her as if he could protect her from the harsh realities of their situation through sheer force of will. Colt was quiet for a long moment, his fingers combing through her hair as he considered their options, none of which seemed particularly promising. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his honesty both refreshing and terrifying. "All I know is that I can't go back to the way things were before I met you. I can't go back to being alone, to not caring whether I live or die, to thinking that redemption is just a word on a town sign." His voice was rough with emotion, and Evangeline could hear the vulnerability beneath his words, the fear that maybe what they had found together was too good to last. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said firmly, lifting her head to look into his eyes, her own blazing with determination and love. "Whatever comes, whatever the cost, we'll face it together. Because I'm not going back either, Colt. I'm not going back to being ashamed of who I am or apologizing for loving you. If they want to call me a sinner, then so be it. At least I'll be a sinner who knows what it feels like to be truly loved." Her words were a declaration of war against the forces that would keep them apart, and Colt felt his heart swell with pride and love for this incredible woman who had somehow found the courage to choose happiness over respectability, love over safety. "Then we'll be sinners together," he said, sealing the promise with a kiss that tasted of forever and felt like coming home. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Colt and Evangeline began to plan their future together, knowing that it wouldn't be easy, but determined to fight for the love they had found in each other's arms. They would face whatever challenges came their way as a team, two wounded souls who had found healing in each other's love, two sinners who had discovered that redemption wasn't about being perfect, but about being brave enough to love and be loved in return. The ride back to town was bittersweet, filled with the knowledge that their night of paradise was ending, but also with the promise of many more to come. They rode slowly, reluctant to return to the harsh realities of Redemption Creek, but knowing that they couldn't hide in their oasis forever. The morning sun was warm on their faces, and the desert bloomed around them with wildflowers that seemed to celebrate their newfound love, creating a carpet of color that stretched as far as the eye could see. But as they crested the hill that overlooked the town, they could see that something was wrong. Smoke was rising from the direction of the church, and even from a distance, they could see people running through the streets in obvious panic. Colt's hand instinctively went to his gun as his eyes scanned the scene below, his body tensing with the alertness of a man who had learned to expect trouble around every corner. "What's happening?" Evangeline asked, her voice tight with worry as she took in the chaos below. Her first thought was of fire, always a deadly threat in a town built mostly of wood and hope. But as they drew closer, it became clear that the smoke was coming from something else entirely. "Looks like we've got visitors," Colt said grimly, his jaw tightening as he spotted the horses tied up outside the saloon, animals that bore the distinctive brands of the Crimson Creek Gang, a group of outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory for months. And not the kind you invite to Sunday dinner. His voice was calm, but Evangeline could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested casually but ready on the butt of his gun. They rode into town to find chaos and fear in equal measure. The Crimson Creek Gang had arrived sometime during the night, and their leader, a man known only as Scarface Jake, had made it clear that they intended to take whatever they wanted from the town and its residents. The sheriff was nowhere to be found, having apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor and disappeared into the desert rather than face down 6 heavily armed outlaws with nothing but a rusty badge and a prayer. "Well, well, well," came a voice from the shadows of the saloon porch, and Evangeline felt Colt stiffen beside her as a man stepped into the sunlight, his face bearing the distinctive scar that had given him his nickname. "If it isn't the famous Colt Blackwood, riding into town like some kind of hero. Heard you'd gone soft, Blackwood, but I didn't believe it until I saw you with my own eyes, playing house with the preacher's whore." The insult hit Evangeline like a physical blow, but before she could react, Colt was off his horse and standing in the street, his hands hanging loose at his sides in the deceptively casual stance of a man who was ready to kill. "That's quite enough, Jake," he said, his voice deadly calm, in the way that made smart men start running and stupid men start reaching for their guns. "The lady's name is Miss Rose, and you'll address her with respect or not at all." Scarface Jake laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made Evangeline's skin crawl. "Lady, that's rich, coming from you, Blackwood. We all know what she is, just like we all know what you are. A killer, trying to play at being respectable, and a whore, trying to play at being a lady. It's almost touching, really, if it wasn't so pathetic." The words were designed to provoke, and they succeeded admirably. Colt's hand moved to his gun with lightning speed, but Jake was ready for him, his own weapon clearing leather with the practiced ease of a man who had killed before and expected to kill again. The two men faced each other in the dusty street, the morning sun casting long shadows that seemed to point toward the inevitable confrontation, like accusing fingers. "This doesn't have to end in blood, Jake," Colt said, though his tone suggested that he wouldn't particularly mind if it did. "Take your boys and ride out of here, and we'll call it even. Stay, and I'll put you in the ground where you belong." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of a man who had never lost a gunfight and didn't intend to start now. "Big words from a man who's forgotten what he is," Jake sneered, his scarred face twisting into an ugly grin. "You think love makes you stronger, Blackwood? It makes you weak. It gives you something to lose, something to protect. And that's going to get you killed." His words carried the weight of experience, and Evangeline felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that he might be right. The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The tension in the air so thick it could be cut with a knife. The townspeople had scattered, taking cover behind buildings and barricaded doors, leaving the street empty, except for the 2 gunfighters and the woman who had somehow become the prize they were fighting over. Evangeline wanted to run, wanted to hide, wanted to do anything except stand there and watch the man she loved prepare to risk his life for her honor. But then she remembered his words from the night before, his promise to be the devil who held her, if that's what it took. And she found her courage. "Colt," she called out, her voice clear and strong despite the fear that was eating at her insides like acid. "I love you. Whatever happens, remember that I love you." Her words were a benediction and a battle cry, a reminder of what he was fighting for, and why it mattered. The effect on Colt was immediate and profound. His shoulders straightened, his stance became even more confident, and when he looked at Jake, there was something in his eyes that made the outlaw take an involuntary step backward. "You're right about one thing, Jake," Colt said, his voice carrying across the empty street like the toll of a funeral bell. "Love does give a man something to protect, and there's nothing more dangerous than a man protecting what he loves." The draw, when it came, was faster than thought, faster than sight, faster than anything Evangeline had ever imagined possible. Both men moved at the same instant, their hands blurring as they reached for their weapons. But Colt was just a fraction of a second faster, just a hair more accurate, just a little bit more motivated by the woman who stood watching from the sidelines with her heart in her throat. The sound of the gunshots echoed off the buildings like thunder, and for a moment that lasted forever, both men stood frozen in the classic gunfighter's pose, smoke curling from the barrels of their weapons. Then Jake's gun fell from nerveless fingers, and he crumpled to the dust with a look of surprise on his scarred face, his eyes already glazing over with the approach of death. The remaining members of the Crimson Creek gang, seeing their leader fall, decided that discretion was indeed the better part of valor and spurred their horses out of town in a cloud of dust and cowardice, leaving their dead leader behind like a discarded playing card. The townspeople began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces showing a mixture of relief and awe as they looked at the man who had just saved them from a fate worse than death. But Colt had eyes only for Evangeline, who was running toward him across the dusty street with tears streaming down her face and love shining in her eyes like stars. He caught her in his arms and spun her around, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. Overwhelmed by the knowledge that they had survived, that their love had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. "It's over," he whispered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "It's finally over, darling. We're free." His words were a promise and a prayer, a declaration that their past was behind them, and their future stretched out ahead like an open road leading to paradise. The townspeople gathered around them, their faces showing a new respect for the man they had once feared and the woman they had once scorned. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife who had been so quick to condemn Evangeline, was the first to step forward, her face flushed with shame and gratitude in equal measure. "Miss Rose," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We judged you harshly, and we were wrong. You and Mr. Blackwood. You saved us all today, and we won't forget it." Her words were echoed by the other townspeople, who began to crowd around the couple with expressions of gratitude and newfound respect. But it was the voice that came from behind them that made Evangeline's heart stop in her chest. "Evangeline," came the familiar sound of her father's voice, and she turned to see Reverend Rose standing at the edge of the crowd, his face showing a mixture of pride and regret that made her eyes fill with tears all over again. "Papa," she whispered, the word falling from her lips like a prayer, as she took a tentative step toward the man who had cast her out in anger and shame. "Papa, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Her voice broke on the words, and she felt Colt's hand squeeze hers in support and encouragement. The Reverend's face crumpled, and he crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, pulling his daughter into his arms with a sob that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "No, my dear girl," he said, his voice thick with tears and regret. "I'm the one who should be sorry. I let my pride and my anger blind me to what really mattered. I forgot that love and forgiveness are supposed to be stronger than judgment and condemnation." The reunion was witnessed by the entire town, and there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as father and daughter embraced for the first time in months, their tears washing away the pain and anger that had kept them apart. When they finally separated, the Reverend turned to Colt with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and appraisal. "Mr. Blackwood," he said formally, extending his hand to the man who had saved his daughter's life and possibly her soul, "I believe I owe you a debt of gratitude that I can never repay. You've shown me what it means to truly love someone, to be willing to sacrifice everything for their happiness and safety." His words were sincere and heartfelt, and Colt felt a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. "The only payment I want, Reverend," Colt said, his voice steady and sure, "is your blessing to marry your daughter. I love her more than life itself, and I swear to you on my honor that I'll spend every day of my life making her happy and keeping her safe." His proposal was formal and old-fashioned, a gesture of respect for the man who had raised the woman he loved. The Reverend's smile was like the sun breaking through storm clouds, bright and warm and full of promise. "Son," he said, his voice carrying the weight of paternal approval, "I can't think of anything that would make me happier. Evangeline has found herself a good man, and I have a feeling that you found yourself a good woman. God bless you both." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the same church where Evangeline had once been condemned as a sinner. But this time, the pews were filled with friends and well-wishers who had come to celebrate the union of two people who had found love in the most unlikely of circumstances. Evangeline wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, and carried a bouquet of desert roses that Colt had picked himself from their special place by the spring. Colt stood at the altar in a new black suit, his hair slicked back, and his face shining with happiness and love as he watched his bride walk down the aisle on her father's arm. The Reverend performed the ceremony himself, his voice strong and sure as he spoke the words that would bind his daughter to the man who had saved them all, both literally and figuratively. When they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the church, and when Colt kissed his bride for the first time as her husband, the congregation erupted in cheers and applause that could probably be heard in the next county. They were no longer the fallen preacher's daughter and the notorious gunfighter. They were simply Colt and Evangeline Blackwood, husband and wife, partners in love and life, and everything that mattered. The reception was held in the church hall, with food donated by every family in town, and music provided by Old Pete's fiddle and Mrs. Murphy's piano. They danced their first dance to a waltz that seemed to go on forever, lost in each other's eyes and oblivious to the crowd of well-wishers who surrounded them with love and laughter and hope for their future. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift away, Colt and Evangeline found themselves alone on the church steps, looking out at the desert landscape that had brought them together and would always hold a special place in their hearts. The stars were out in full force, painting the sky with diamonds and reminding them of that first magical night when they had discovered that love really could conquer all. "So, Mrs. Blackwood," Colt said, his voice warm with love and amusement as he pulled his wife closer to his side, "any regrets about marrying a notorious gunfighter? and becoming the talk of the territory? His question was teasing, but there was a hint of real concern beneath the humor. A need to know that she was truly happy with the choice she had made. Evangeline laughed, the sound like silver bells in the desert air, and turned in his arms to face him fully, her hands coming up to frame his face with infinite tenderness. "My only regret," she said, her voice soft but sure, "is that it took us so long to find each other. I love you, Colt Blackwood, gunfighter, hero, and most importantly, my husband. And I always will." Their kiss was witnessed only by the stars and the desert wind, but it was a promise that would last a lifetime and beyond. They had found their redemption in each other's arms, had discovered that love really could transform even the most unlikely sinners into something beautiful and pure and eternal. Years later, when their children asked them to tell the story of how they met, Colt and Evangeline would smile at each other across their kitchen table and remember that magical night when a fallen preacher's daughter and a notorious gunfighter had found love under the desert stars. They would tell their children about the power of forgiveness and the courage it takes to love someone despite what the world might think. And they would always end the story the same way. "They called me a sinner," Evangeline would say, her eyes twinkling with mischief and memory. "And he said he'd be the devil who held me. And you know what? He kept his promise, and we lived happily ever after, just like in the fairy tales." And their children would laugh and beg to hear the story again, never tiring of the tale of how their parents had found love in the most unlikely of places and proved that sometimes the best kind of love is the kind that's worth fighting for. The desert wind still whispers their story through the cottonwood trees by the spring, and the stars still shine down on the place where two wounded souls found healing in each other's love. And if you listen carefully on a clear night, you might still hear the echo of their laughter, the sound of two people who discovered that redemption isn't about being perfect, but about being brave enough to love and be loved in return, no matter what the cost. In the end, Colt Blackwood hung up his guns and became a rancher, building a life with his beloved wife that was filled with love and laughter, and the kind of happiness that comes from knowing you found your other half. Evangeline bloomed like a desert rose in the warmth of his love, becoming the heart of their community and the mother of 5 beautiful children who grew up knowing that love really could conquer all. And though the townspeople of Redemption Creek eventually forgot the scandal that had once surrounded the preacher's daughter, they never forgot the lesson that Colt and Evangeline had taught them. That sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the words, "They called me a sinner," and end with the promise, "Then I'll be the devil who holds you tonight." Because in the end, love isn't about being perfect. It's about being perfect for each other. And that's a kind of redemption that no amount of judgment or condemnation can ever take away.